On the morning of February 13th, 2026, three Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps naval vessels conducted what Tehran described as a routine maritime exercise in the southern approaches to the Strait of Hormuz. They were not routine. The vessels, two Sina-class fast attack craft and one Mauj-class frigate equipped with Nor anti-ship missiles, took up positions that, according to U.S. Fifth Fleet tracking data, placed them within 22 nautical miles of a commercial tanker corridor carrying approximately 17 million barrels of crude oil per day. The U.S. Navy's USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group responded. Within 90 minutes, two FA-18 Super Hornets were wheels up from the Lincoln's flight deck. The intercept was clean. No shots were fired, but the proximity, the timing, and, critically, what Iranian state media said immediately afterward changed the nature of this standoff in ways that most of the world's media has not yet fully processed. This is not a flare-up. This is not posturing for domestic audiences. What is unfolding in and around the Strait of Hormuz right now is the product of years of compounding strategic decisions, accumulated miscalculations, and a deterrence framework that is, by almost any serious analytical measure, beginning to fail. The window is narrowing, and the next 48 hours are critical. To understand what is genuinely at stake here, we need to establish exactly what has changed, not over the past week, but over the past 18 months. Since mid-2024, Iran's IRGC Navy has increased its operational tempo in the Strait of Hormuz and the broader Persian Gulf by a figure that U.S. naval intelligence estimates at roughly 40% above the prior 5-year baseline. That alone is significant. But the character of these operations has changed as much as the frequency. Iranian forces are no longer conducting what analysts call presence patrols, symbolic demonstrations of access denial capability. They are now conducting what can only be described as rehearsal operations, positioning exercises that mirror the early phases of a coordinated maritime choke point closure. At the same time, the diplomatic architecture that once provided a pressure release valve for this kind of tension has effectively collapsed. The JCPOA, the 2015 nuclear agreement, is functionally dead. Indirect talks that resumed in late 2024 broke down in January of this year after Tehran announced it had enriched uranium to 84% purity, 1 percentage point below weapons grade. The International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed this. The U.S. Treasury responded with a new tranche of sanctions. Iran expelled 2 IAEA inspectors within 72 hours. That sequence, enrichment, confirmation, sanctions, expulsion, is not the behavior of a state managing escalation. It is the behavior of a state that has concluded escalation management is no longer in its interest. Meanwhile, in Washington, the political environment has produced a posture that combines maximum economic pressure with genuine strategic ambiguity about military red lines. That ambiguity, which was once considered a feature of deterrence, is now functioning as a vulnerability. When an adversary cannot reliably identify your red lines, they will probe. Iran is probing. Let us be precise about the military equation here, because precision matters enormously when assessing whether this situation can be contained. The Strait of Hormuz is 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. At any given moment, between 12 and 20 very large crude carriers, vessels carrying 2 million barrels of oil each, are transiting that channel. The navigable lane for these vessels is approximately 3 kilometers wide on each side with a separation zone in the middle. This is not a geographic abstraction. This is a physical funnel, and Iran sits along the northern edge of it for its entire length. Iran's primary maritime denial capability rests on 3 pillars. First, its inventory of anti-ship missiles. The Nor missile, Iran's domestically produced derivative of the Chinese C-802, has a range of approximately 170 kilometers, flies at sea skimming altitude, and carries a 165 kilogram warhead. A hit from a Nor on a loaded VLCC does not sink it instantly, but it disables propulsion, which in a narrow shipping lane is effectively a kill. Iran is believed to hold several hundred of these missiles, distributed across coastal batteries, naval vessels, and mobile launch platforms. The more advanced Qatar missile extends this range to approximately 300 kilometers and introduces a degree of terrain-hugging capability that complicates radar acquisition. Second, Iran's fast attack craft doctrine. The IRGC Navy operates a swarm tactic doctrine. Large numbers of small, high-speed fiberglass vessels armed with RPGs, heavy machine guns, and occasionally man-portable anti-armor weapons designed to overwhelm the close-in defensive systems of larger naval vessels. This doctrine was tested and found credible in the early 2000s during U.S. war games collectively known as Millennium Challenge 2002, where simulated IRGC swarm tactics produced catastrophic results for the Blue Force, the stand-in for U.S. naval assets. The U.S. military revised its doctrine afterward, but the underlying vulnerability, the difficulty of simultaneously engaging dozens of fast-moving small targets in confined waters, has never been fully resolved. Third, and most critically for the current moment, mines. Iran possesses one of the world's largest stockpiles of naval mines, including moored contact mines, bottom influence mines, and rocket-propelled rising mines. The EM-52 rocket-propelled mine, which Iran is assessed to have acquired from China in the 1990s, sits on the seafloor and launches a torpedo-like projectile upward when a vessel passes overhead. Mine-clearing operations in a contested, narrow waterway under fire are measured not in hours, but in days and weeks. What most analysts are missing right now is this: the combination of these three systems, cruise missiles, swarm craft, and mines, does not need to close the Strait of Hormuz permanently to cause catastrophic economic disruption. It only needs to create a credible threat of unpredictable attack. The insurance and shipping markets respond to probability, not certainty. A single successful strike on a VLCC in the Strait would likely cause a temporary suspension of commercial transits. War risk insurance premiums, already elevated, would go vertical. Shipping companies would reroute. The effective closure of the Strait does not require Iranian military victory. It requires Iranian willingness to inflict cost. That willingness appears to be increasing. The military equation has changed. Now let us examine what the strategic layer looks like for each of the four key actors. For the United States, the core problem is a deterrence credibility gap that has been widening since at least 2019, when Iran shot down a U.S. RQ-4 Global Hawk surveillance drone and the Trump administration chose not to respond militarily. That decision, defensible on its own terms, was nonetheless read by Tehran as an important data point. It established an implicit ceiling on American willingness to use force. Every subsequent incident, the 2020 Qasem Soleimani strike being the obvious exception, has been assessed by Iranian strategists against that baseline. The Biden administration added additional data points through its handling of Red Sea Houthi operations, where months of U.S. and U.K. strikes failed to suppress Houthi missile and drone attacks on commercial shipping. The lesson Tehran drew was specific. American firepower is real, but American strategic patience for sustained, ambiguous conflict is limited. The current administration faces a dilemma that has no clean resolution. A military strike on Iranian nuclear facilities, the option that appears on the table, would require an extraordinarily complex operation. Iranian nuclear infrastructure is dispersed, hardened, and in some cases buried under tens of meters of reinforced concrete. The Fordo enrichment facility, built inside a mountain near Qom, is assessed to require penetrating munitions that only the U.S. GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator can reliably defeat. Delivering those weapons requires B-2 stealth bombers operating at extreme range from Diego Garcia or continental U.S. bases, supported by an aerial refueling train of extraordinary scale. The operational window for such a strike is narrow, the intelligence requirements are immense, and the regional consequences, Iranian retaliation against U.S. forces in Iraq, Syria, and the Gulf, plus potential Hezbollah activation in Lebanon, are severe. For Iran, the strategic calculus is equally constrained, but differently structured. Tehran's core objective is regime survival and the preservation of its nuclear program as a strategic deterrent. It does not need a deliverable nuclear weapon to achieve deterrence value. The ambiguity of being 84% of the way there, combined with demonstrated missile capability and regional proxy networks, constitutes a deterrence posture in itself. The danger is that this strategy requires continuous escalation to remain credible, and continuous escalation increases the probability of a miscalculation that produces a response Iran cannot manage. For China, this situation is a compound problem. Beijing imports approximately 1.8 million barrels per day through the Strait of Hormuz. Any sustained disruption to Hormuz transits directly threatens Chinese industrial output and domestic stability. At the same time, China has no desire to see Iran militarily dismantled by the United States, because Iran is a key node in Belt and Road connectivity and a counterweight to U.S. Gulf influence. Beijing is therefore in the uncomfortable position of having significant leverage over Tehran through oil purchase agreements and infrastructure financing, but limited willingness to deploy that leverage in ways that might appear cooperative with Washington. For Russia, the calculus is more straightforward and more cynical. An oil price spike driven by Hormuz disruption is, in the short term, a revenue windfall for Moscow. Russian oil, sold at discount to Asian buyers, becomes relatively more attractive when Gulf supply is uncertain. Russia has no direct military role to play in the strait, but its interest in extended, costly American strategic distraction in the Middle East is real and has been consistent across multiple administrations. Military planners in Washington, Riyadh, and Tel Aviv are recalculating several things simultaneously right now. First, the timeline to Iranian weapons-grade enrichment. Second, the viability of a strike option that sets back the program without triggering a wider regional war. Third, and most immediately, the threshold conditions under which Iranian action against commercial shipping in the Strait would trigger a U.S. military response. This alters the risk calculus for every tanker captain, every insurance underwriter, and every oil trader on the planet. The diplomatic architecture here deserves careful examination, because what remains of it is less than it appears. The European Troika, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, has been attempting to maintain a channel of communication with Tehran throughout 2025 and into this year. Those efforts have produced no substantive concessions from either side. The Europeans face a structural problem. They have insufficient economic leverage over Iran since the reimposition of U.S. sanctions effectively removed European companies from the Iranian market years ago, and they have insufficient political leverage over Washington to offer Iran meaningful sanctions relief. At the United Nations, the Security Council is gridlocked in its now familiar geometry. Russia and China will veto any resolution with enforcement teeth. The United States knows this and has largely stopped drafting them. The UN's role in this crisis is, at this point, more rhetorical than operational. In Washington, the domestic political dimension is creating its own pressure. A segment of the foreign policy establishment, representing roughly the interventionist wing of both major parties, is publicly advocating for what they term decisive action before Iran crosses the final enrichment threshold. A different segment, particularly among fiscal conservatives, is wary of another open-ended Middle East military commitment, given the ongoing costs of supporting Ukraine and the Taiwan deterrence posture. This is not a simple hawkish versus dovish division. It is a genuinely complex debate about risk, resource allocation, and strategic priority, and it is happening in real time under deadline pressure. In Tehran, Supreme Leader Khamenei faces his own domestic constraints. The protest movements of 2022 and 2023 revealed genuine fractures in Iranian civil society. Economic hardship driven by sanctions has produced real popular frustration, but historically, external pressure and the threat of military attack has strengthened rather than weakened the hardliners' political position inside Iran. There is no serious evidence that the Iranian population's desire for regime change, however real, translates into reduced military resistance to external coercion. The economic stakes of a Hormuz disruption require precise quantification because the numbers are sobering. Approximately 21 million barrels of oil pass through the Strait of Hormuz every day. This represents roughly 21% of global petroleum liquids consumption. There is no alternative pipeline route of sufficient capacity to compensate for a full closure. The Saudi East-West pipeline can move approximately 5 million barrels per day to Red Sea ports, and the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline adds another 1.5 million barrels of bypass capacity. That leaves a gap of 14 to 15 million barrels per day that simply has no viable reroute option in any relevant near-term time frame. In practical terms, even a partial disruption, a successful Iranian attack on one or two major tankers that causes a 30-day suspension of commercial transits, would, based on historical modeling and current market structure, produce an oil price spike of between $40 and $80 per barrel above current levels. At current Brent pricing, that means crude could move from approximately $75 per barrel to between $115 and $155 per barrel within days. The downstream effects of that kind of price shock are not abstract. Global aviation fuel costs would increase immediately. Diesel and gasoline prices would spike at the pump in the United States and Europe within 2 to 3 weeks as the supply chain works through existing inventories. For emerging market economies that import oil, India, Pakistan, Egypt, much of sub-Saharan Africa, the impact would be severe and immediate, potentially triggering balance of payments crises in the most vulnerable cases. The shipping industry itself faces a compounding problem. War risk insurance in the Strait is already priced at a significant premium over standard maritime coverage. A confirmed military incident would cause the insurance market to apply what underwriters call additional war risk premiums that could add several $millions per voyage to operating costs. Many shipping operators, particularly smaller independent ones, would simply refuse transits until the risk is clarified. This means the economic impact of a military incident in the Strait would begin to materialize before the physical oil supply disruption driven by commercial risk aversion. Global equity markets would react within minutes of a confirmed incident. Energy sector equities would spike. Airline and transportation stocks would sell off sharply. Emerging market sovereign bonds would face immediate pressure. The Federal Reserve and other major central banks would face an impossible choice: maintain their existing rate posture while inflation spikes due to an energy price shock, or signal accommodation that markets might interpret as insufficient. For the average household in the United States, a sustained $50 per barrel increase in oil prices translates to roughly 50 cents per gallon at the pump, on top of existing inflationary pressures. For households in Europe, where energy costs are already structurally higher due to the residual effects of the 2022 Russian gas disruption, the impact would be proportionally more severe. This is the economic reality that sits underneath what is often described in headline shorthand as tensions in the Strait of Hormuz. The clock is ticking, and it is measuring something real. For those tracking this situation in real time, whether as investors, policymakers, or informed citizens, the following signals will provide the clearest early indication of where this is heading. First, watch IRGC naval positioning, Commercial satellite operators and open-source maritime tracking platforms will show whether Iranian fast attack craft return to port following the February 13th incident or maintain forward deployment in the southern strait approaches. Forward deployment, particularly if it includes vessels equipped with anti-ship missiles, is a concrete indicator of sustained operational intent rather than one-off posturing. Second, watch the oil futures curve. Specifically, the spread between front-month Brent crude futures and contracts 6 months out. A widening backwardation, where near-term prices spike above longer-term prices, indicates that markets are pricing a short-term supply disruption. A flattening or inversion would suggest markets believe the situation will stabilize. The shape of the curve is often a more honest assessment of near-term risk than any official statement. Third, watch U.S. naval force disposition. Public reporting from U.S. Fifth Fleet in Bahrain and satellite imagery of carrier strike group positioning in the Arabian Sea and Gulf of Oman will indicate whether the Pentagon is moving to a deterrence posture, increasing visible presence to signal cost, or a strike preparation posture, which would involve dispersal of assets to reduce vulnerability to Iranian ballistic missile attack. These are operationally different configurations, and they are distinguishable by open-source analysis. Fourth, watch official statements from Saudi Arabia and the UAE. These Gulf states are Iran's immediate neighbors and the most directly exposed to any escalation. Their public language and any emergency ministerial travel will be among the earliest indicators of how the regional architecture is reading this crisis. Fifth, watch the IAEA Board of Governors. Any emergency session convened in Vienna to address Iranian enrichment developments would signal that the technical assessment of the nuclear timeline has shifted, which would in turn accelerate the military planning timeline. The strategic balance is shifting. These signals will tell us how quickly and in which direction. Step back from the immediate operational picture and consider what this moment represents in the longer arc of the post-2003 Middle East order. The fundamental architecture that has governed the Persian Gulf since the First Gulf War, American military primacy, enforced through forward-deployed naval and air assets, guaranteeing the flow of energy through the Strait of Hormuz, is under pressure in ways that have no clear precedent in the past 3 decades. That architecture was built on 2 assumptions. First, that American military capability was sufficiently overwhelming to deter Iranian military adventurism. Second, that American political will to exercise that capability when necessary was credible. Both assumptions are now being actively tested. Iran's missile arsenal, with over 3,000 ballistic missiles assessed in its inventory, including the Shahab-3 with a range of 2,000 kilometers, the Imad with precision guidance capability, and the Khaybar-Sheikhan at 1,450 kilometers range and assessed Mach 14 to 16 terminal velocity in its hypersonic glide configuration, has made the cost of American military presence in the Gulf region meaningfully higher than it was in 2003. American carriers, which were once considered the defining instruments of uncontested power projection, are now the subject of serious debate within the U.S. Navy itself about survivability in anti-access area denial environments. This matters beyond the Iran-U.S. bilateral. China has been watching the evolution of Iranian anti-access capabilities with professional interest because many of the same system categories, anti-ship missiles, swarming doctrine, mine warfare, are central to Chinese military planning for a Taiwan contingency. The lessons drawn from Hormuz will be applied in the Pacific. If Iran successfully disrupts commercial shipping through the strait with acceptable consequences, it validates a playbook that other regional powers will study carefully. Russia's calculus, as noted, runs through the energy market. But there is a deeper strategic dimension. Every American military resource committed to deterring or responding to Iranian action in the Gulf is a resource unavailable for the European theater. This is not a coincidence of timing. The synchronization of pressure across multiple theaters, Ukraine, the Gulf, the South China Sea, reflects an increasingly coordinated approach among the states that have concluded American strategic overextension is achievable and exploitable. This may be a preview of larger confrontations, not because any of the parties necessarily wants escalation, they don't, at least not in its uncontrolled form, but because the structural conditions that produce miscalculation are present and worsening: compressed timelines, degraded communication channels, domestic political pressures on multiple sides, and a deterrence framework that has lost coherence. These are precisely the conditions under which historical great power competitions have produced outcomes that no party intended. Here is where we stand. A strait 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point is carrying 1/5 of the world's daily oil supply. Along its northern shore sits a state that has spent 40 years building the military and political infrastructure to threaten that passage, and which now has a nuclear program advanced enough to fundamentally alter the regional security calculus within months, not years. Facing it is a superpower whose military capability remains formidable but whose strategic credibility has been tested repeatedly and found, by adversaries at least, to have limits. The honest assessment is this: the probability of a controlled, negotiated de-escalation, the scenario that markets are still partially pricing, requires several things to happen simultaneously. It requires Iranian leadership to conclude that the costs of continued escalation exceed the benefits. It requires American political leadership to offer something credible enough to make that calculation attractive. It requires the regional actors, Saudi Arabia, Israel, the UAE, to refrain from actions that could trigger Iranian retaliation and lock all parties into a dynamic they can no longer exit. And it requires all of this to happen within a timeline constrained by nuclear enrichment physics. That is a demanding set of conditions. It is not impossible, but the window is narrowing. What happens in the Strait of Hormuz over the coming days and weeks will not merely determine oil prices or shipping insurance premiums. It will determine whether the post-Cold War international order retains any remaining capacity to manage state-level nuclear escalation through diplomacy, or whether we are entering a period in which the instruments of military power are once again the primary language of international politics. The uncertainty is real, the stakes are genuine, and the decisions being made right now in Tehran, in Washington, in Beijing, in Riyadh, will shape the strategic environment for a generation. Do not look away from this. Subscribe for every update. The next 24 hours will tell us everything. Sources: U.S. Naval Institute, IAEA Board Reports, Lloyd's of London War Risk Index, ISW Regional Analysis, US EIA Petroleum Data, Open Source OSINT Maritime Tracking,